Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman, who is a professor of Tanakh at Bar Ilan University and a graduate of Princeton University and Yeshivat Har Etzion, and author of a number of books, including Ani Mammon, Biblical Criticism, Historical Truth, and the 13 Principles of Faith, which was published by Magid. And now we'll be discussing his newest book, which is the Haggadah Echoes of Egypt, a Haggadah published by Koren, and it's actually part of their series, the Koren Tanakh of the Land of Israel, which we've discussed here on the podcast with the editor-in-chief, David Arnowitz. So this is a Haggadah in that series, if you will. So thank you, Rabbi Dr. Berman, for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Nachiel, you speak so quickly, you probably get a ton into a podcast.
In some ways, it's hard because I speak very quickly. Sometimes I have to slow myself down, and then the guests sometimes don't. So I have the listeners telling me, well, we want to put it on 1.5, 2 times speed, but then Nachi, you're too fast, and then the listeners, the guests, that's what we have to like kind of go. Yeah, so we'll try to slow it down. So, all right, let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, right. It's really important because my background is totally what leads me to the Haggadah. Okay, so I'm nishtahin and nishtaher. By that I mean I am neither a Baal Tshuva nor from birth. My parents were kind of traditional and but not Shomer Shabbos. I started elementary school shortly after the Six-Day War, and so there was this big awakening of Jewish identity, so my parents sent me to Yeshiva Day School. I went to SAR Academy in the Bronx, in Riverdale. And Baruch Hashem, I got a nice day school education and had very wonderful teachers and Rebbeim and kind of caught the bug, and by the time my bar mitzvah, I was Shomer Torah mitzvos. But it means that for my entire life, I've kind of had a leg in two worlds, kind of a world of, my parents are both very educated and worldly, and this world of Torah that we have. And I kind of continued with that. I went to a yeshiva high school, and then I learned in Gush, and I went to Princeton. And so always kind of back, I wouldn't say back and forth, but kind of looking at the world with two eyes, one from the Torah world and one from outside the Torah world. At some point, this led me, after I finished smicha in Gush, I was kind of into Tanakh, even though real men learn Talmud. I was into Tanakh. What can you do? Something happened. I don't know. That I felt was my calling, and I kind of wanted to take it a little further because they don't really it's like chugim in Tanakh, a shiur here, a shiur there. So I went to Bar Ilan University and I got my doctorate there and kind of pursued it from there. And there's lots of subdivisions in the world of Tanakh, which are all very interesting. For the purposes of our talk today and then this sefer, this Haggadah that's come out, I had for a long time I'd had a fascination with the archaeology about Yetziat Mitzrayim, or the claim that there's a lack. But a lot of colleagues that I'm in touch with were convinced that there's plenty to talk about. And I really wanted to kind of get into it more. Most of all, I wanted to visit Egypt myself. And I wanted to see it for myself. But I didn't want to go stam as a tourist and stare at pyramids and get on a camel and take a picture. I wanted to go with people who understood. And there are real mumchim out there. Not Jewish. They happen to be Ovei Yisrael, all of them. And they know a lot about Egyptology, and they read hieroglyphs in ancient Egyptian, and they know the culture, and they know a fair deal about the Tanakh as well. So I went with one such person, my Egyptology Rabbi, James Hoffmeyer, and this was in January of 21. That means the height of COVID. There were no tourists in Egypt except us. When I say us, I went together with a group of Christian clergy and scholars. And I thought this was because I walk around with my kippah on all the time. It doesn't matter where that's what I do. And I figured, okay, if I'm going to be in Egypt with a kippah on, best to have 15 goyim surrounding me, Christians, as bodyguards, and then nothing will happen. And a kol tov, everything worked out, and it was an unbelievable experience, just jaw-dropping, eye-opening, and hearing the things that Hoffmeyer and another scholar who were there, wow, page after page, pasuk after pasuk suddenly came to life. And I remember the last day of the trip, I'm sitting there having a coffee with Hoffmeyer on the banks of the Nile, and I thought to myself, one day in Mashiach Zeit, wouldn't it be amazing to bring Yidden to come see this stuff? And then about an hour later, I thought to myself, well, maybe we don't need to wait for the Mashiach. And then in the winters of 22 and 23, I did two tour groups each winter and brought people, and it was an amazing experience. And all the time I'm learning more and more about this and reading the scholarship and making connections and reading connections that other people have made. When I say connections, I mean some things that you can only understand that the Torah is doing because the people there were accustomed to a certain type of cloth or a certain type of speech, and some things where the Torah is polemicizing, arguing back, taking issue with things that were going on in Egyptian culture. And then, of course, the war broke out. And when you can't bring Jews to Egypt, you have to bring Egypt to the Jews. And that's how we get to this Haggadah. The idea was to kind of share some of this insight. Some might call it Chachma. I would consider it Torah, following the Rambam. The Rambam, as many of us know, in the third chelik of the Moreh Nevuchim, on many occasions, especially things having to do with the Mishkan and the Avoda, will say, well, what the Torah is doing here is, I understand, the Rambam says, based on what I've studied about the ancient world, and I can see that the Torah is taking a certain Avodah Zarah practice and kind of being metaher it or lifting it up a little bit and tweaking it. And, the Rambam had limited resources. He says that he tried to find everything he could about the ancient world. And he says the more that I could understand about the ancient world, the more that I would understand Torah better. And I think the Rambam would plotz. He would plotz at the amount of knowledge that we have about the ancient world. So I don't know if everybody would define that as Torah, but the Rambam did, and Ani Hakatan, I am following in his footsteps, at least in terms of a derech of how to think about these things.
So it's interesting. Your background is as a Bible scholar, and then you became interested in Egyptology. So that's your connection.
Yeah.
Whenever I see a new Haggadah, and certainly when I do a podcast on a new Haggadah, I think the question is, same question but the new Chumash Sefer, by the way, it's why another one, right? Why another Haggadah? Do we need this?
How is this Haggadah different from all other Haggadahs?
Exactly. It's the question that has to be asked, right? Every year I've been doing now on Svarim Chatter, I don't know how many years it is, maybe it's 8-9 years with a Twitter account, and it's list of new Haggadahs every year. I think it's like 30, 40, 50 new Haggadahs every year, and I'm sure I'm missing plenty of Haggadahs. Hebrew, English, there's so many new Haggadahs. So we see a Haggadah like this, and this one actually is different. It is unique, but I want to pose the question to you, and you'll explain to listeners, why another Haggadah? What is different about this Haggadah?
Sure. So the Haggadah is called Echoes of Egypt. And Khalil, I wouldn't say it's better or more important, but it is certainly different than any other Haggadah that's out there, because the whole theme of the Haggadah is how our understanding and knowledge of ancient Egyptian culture, drawings, inscriptions, when we understand what they're saying, then we can turn to the Torah and see, oh my gosh, the Torah is using this phrase that it picked up from Egyptian culture, or the Torah is combating this idea, this concept, this way of thinking about kings, this way of thinking about humans, about people, about the gods, about deities, and suddenly just everything comes to life here. Let me give one little example to get us started, okay? So here's an example of something that we've all known since the age of 0, okay? Then that is, if you sit around, even if you don't know Chumash, and you just sit around the Seder a few years in a row, then you know that the Ribbono Shel Olam took us out of Mitzrayim b'yad chazaka v'zroa netuyah. Okay. Now, upon inspection, one discovers that this phrase appears in the Tanakh really only with regard to the events of Yetzias Mitzrayim. That is, even though there are perhaps many other places in the Tanakh where the Ribbono Shel Olam does Nisim v'Niflaot, nonetheless, it will sometimes refer to that as Yad Hashem, but you never see this phrase Yad Chazaka v'Zroa netuyah. Well, it turns out that this phrase Yad Chazaka v'Zroa netuyah, when you look at the inscriptions of the pharaohs themselves from the period in which Bnei Yisrael were in Mitzrayim, which by my counting, my figuring of the dates is roughly 1500 to 1200 BCE, which happens to be the period of the greatest zenith, peak of Egyptian history. It's called the Egyptian New Kingdom. What you see is that pharaoh after pharaoh describes in their inscriptions, which you can go and see, they describe their own actions as things they did with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. As in, the pharaoh defeated the Libyans with his mighty hand. The pharaoh one day was walking along, and there was a diamond the size of his fist at his feet, and he reached out and lifted it with his outstretched arm. And on and on and on, hundreds and hundreds of times. So what's happening here? What's happening here is called cultural appropriation. It's where you take the opposition's thunder and you make it your own. It's kind of like when they say Black Lives Matter, and now today we say, in light of all the anti-Semitism, Jewish Lives Matter, or Blue Lives Matter, or something like that. You're taking a phrase from the opposition and you're using it to kind of, as we would say in Hebrew, the hashiv milchama hashara. That means to spit it back at the other side. And so what the Torah is doing in describing Yetzias Mitzrayim as what HaKadosh Baruch Hu does with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm is taking the Pharaoh's thunder and out-pharaohing the Pharaohs and showing here the Ribono Shel Olam is defeating the Pharaoh with his own language, and that's how we're going to remember it. And this was probably a phrase that the Bnei Yisrael in Mitzrayim, certainly when they were enslaved, heard this, saw this, and now to help them understand the godless of the Ribono Shel Olam, it's now used to describe the way in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu is defeating the Mitzrayim himself.
And that really goes to the next question, which is, why should we understand the historical and the archaeological context of Egyptian history and the Haggadah, right? When we're reading Shmais, when we're reading the Haggadah in general, when we're saying, well, what happened in Egypt? And as you're saying, and perhaps you have more examples why this is important, you can now have a better appreciation and understanding for the Torah and for the Haggadah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you could say, listen, a good Jew can, sit at the Seder table and say Yad Chazakah and Zohar Netuya, and not have the vaguest notion of anything having to do with Egyptology, and he can still be a good Jew, and he can still be Yotzei Shlosha Dvarim. That's all true. That is all true. So the example that I just gave you, I would say, Nachi, is simply a kiyum in Talmud Torah. That is, any time that I understand any word anywhere in the Kisvei HaKodesh better by me, that's called Talmud Torah. If it's true, it's Talmud Torah. So here it's just a kiyum in Talmud Torah. There's that. Now, sometimes, okay, so that's nice. Sometimes, though, it really makes a difference. It really makes a difference in our understanding. I'll give you another example. You have there in one of the early pages in the Haggadah, you see a picture of, and this is a picture that appears in hundreds of places in Egypt. The gods and the kings are always depicted together, and they're always the same size. I mean, you might have thought that the gods or the goddesses would be much bigger, but they're not. They're exactly in human proportions. And in hundreds of places in Egypt, you see a god and a pharaoh in embrace. When I say embrace, you see like the god pulling the pharaoh toward him by the waist. It's almost erotic. And they are like gazing at each other's face. Okay? And the idea that the Egyptians had here was that this was to show that the pharaoh was beloved to the god and chosen by him. And look how close he is with him. Okay? Now, when we come to Sefer Devarim, and Moshe Rabbeinu depicts Ma'amad Har Sinai, and he says, Panim el panim diber Hashem imachem, face to face, HaKadosh Baruch Hu spoke to you. From an exegetical perspective, from Parshanut, you say, wait a minute, what does that mean that we saw the Ribono Shel Olam face to face? I thought we hold Lo Yirani Ha'adam V'chai. I thought we can't see HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What a strange metaphor that is. But when you understand that really what Moshe Rabbeinu is saying is, by the Mitzrayim, the Paro was the Nivchar. The Paro was beloved to the Ribono Shel Olam, or to their deities. But by us, it's not the leader. I mean, yes, Hashem appreciated Moshe Rabbeinu, but Hashem's connection is not with the leaders. It is not with the kings. Hashem's connection is with Am Yisrael. This already has what I would call an exegetical payoff. We now not only understand what a word means better, we understand a difficult pasuk. What does it mean that we saw Hashem panim, or that Hashem diber panim el panim? Well, this is a way of showing how beloved we were to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that we understand, again, this idea of taking an idea, a trope that's out there in the Egyptian culture, and now the Torah is using it to describe not only a pasuk, but it's helping us understand how the attention that the Ribono Shel Olam pays to the world is no longer to the mighty, but to the people.
Another one that comes to mind is Makas Choshech and Ra and the sun god. I mean, there's so many examples, especially in Egyptology, when you're just understanding, so you can have a greater appreciation and understanding of the Torah and of the Makas and so on and so forth.
Right.
Now, there are some, I think, that find this unsettling, perhaps, to some degree. So what do you say to that?
Okay, well, there are many people who find this unsettling, and each one for a different reason. So, Nachi, you're going to have to tell me which angle of unsettled are we talking here?
Any and all, you pick.
Okay, good. Okay, so one thing that people first of all, I love this because I just think it's Taras Emes. The things that I've said here, I think really work. I like it also because you flip on your internet and it doesn't take too long to find all the claims that there was no such thing as Yetzias Mitzrayim. It's all made up, and when you see dozens and dozens of instances of the types of things that I've just been telling you. Then you come to the ineluctable conclusion that, wow, there were Israelites in Egypt. Okay, that's without necessarily saying we have proof for Kriyas Yamsuf, but proof for the fact that Bnei Israel were in Mitzrayim. I think that is, as far as I'm concerned, beyond contest. And so that's already a good thing to have. When you see no, this was all made up. It's all a fable. That's number one. I think what sometimes people find challenging about thinking in this way, but really, I'll say in my defense, this is not an attack on Berman. This is an attack on the Rambam. Okay, going back to how we opened with a move that the Rambam makes in the third chelek of the Mor Nevuchim. People say, okay, so what you're telling me, Rabbi Dr. Berman, is that you understand the Torah best when you know about the ancient world. But I thought the Torah is eternal. So how could it be eternal if you have to have a degree in Egyptology to understand a simple phrase like Yad Chazakan Zra Netuyah? That doesn't sound eternal. It sounds like you either have to have lived back then or have to have studied a lot of doctorate stuff today. So my answer to that is the following. That's very interesting that the Torah is eternal. I think what we mean by that is two things. That its messages are eternal, the ideas that are in it are eternal, and that the way in which the Torah will convey those messages is going to come out from different psukim and different prakim to different people in different generations. There is no way for the Ribbono Shel Olam to speak a kind of universal Esperanto, that language that people tried to make up that would be like a universal language. So Hashem can't speak in a way that all people understand at all time. That's because of a limitation of mankind, not because of God. We are all of us listening to this are all products of time and place. And so what appeals to us is not necessarily what would have appealed to our fathers, let alone our great-grandfathers, in Europe or wherever they might have come from. And so the Torah will manage to convey its different messages and ideas through different metaphors, through different prakim, different psukim, different neviim, in different places. And this is why, some of the same ideas come up over and over and over again in the Nevi'im, but each time in a different way because it resonates differently in different times and different places. And I think Ipcha Mistabra, the idea that there are certain things you can only understand if you're in ancient, that's right. In ancient Egypt, this is what they needed to understand some of these ideas about what it means that the Ribbono Shel Olam took us out of Mitzrayim by speaking precisely in an idiom that was for them. So as I say, this is a move that the Rambam makes, and I think the truth is it's not just the Rambam. I think we have many Mefarshim who at one point or another, the Rambam does it in perhaps in more wholesale fashion than we find elsewhere, but there are many Mefarshim who say, oh, what's going on here? This is something that was a practice at that time. It's a famous. This is not famous. I don't know how famous it is. It's famous if you're Josh Berman. Okay. There's a Ralbag at the end of Sefer Shmot. It's worth knowing, and so I'm going to share it. Okay. Famous question: why do we have Parshiot Vayakel Pekudei? We have all these details already in Truman Tetzaveh. Why say everything all over again? The Torah could have written, Vayas Betzalel K'chol Asher Tziva Alav Moshe, or something like that. You don't need to say all the details over again. So the Ralbag, at the very, very end of Sefer Shmot, he asks this question. He says, I'm really bothered by this because by us, meaning where he lived, in Provence in the 14th century, he says, we hold that a literary work is perfect when there's nothing that's redundant. And this sure looks very redundant, all this stuff here. And he says, I've heard all the answers that our forefathers have given, and I don't like any of them. And then he answers by saying, it must be that in the time that the Torah was written, this was the convention of writing. This is how people wrote. Yedaber Hanavi lefi haminhag. That's his lashon. Yedaber Hanavi lefi haminhag. Hanavi, in this case, of course, being Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay, and the freaky thing is how correct he was. In other words, this idea that you will have a list of commands and then they are fulfilled, right? Which is what happens with the Mishkan. This happens in so many ancient texts. A king will give a whole list of orders, and then it will say, and then the servant went, and the king said, do A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, and then it says, and the servant went, and he did A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, all laid out. So, that's this is not just the Rambam, and I think it can help us understand a lot of things.
Rabbi obviously being a Maimonidean, so a student of the Rambam's thought. Now, the rest of that conversation we can leave for other episodes, perhaps. This is things that you touch on your other books and so on. I want to turn to the Haggadah. And by the way, just to describe the Haggadah, it's a really nice, beautiful-looking Haggadah, physical Haggadah. It's a larger Haggadah. I wouldn't say it's like coffee table. It's not very heavy. And it has its beautiful, glossy color pages, pictures throughout the entire Haggadah.
Yes, and these glossy pictures, it's important to say, maybe you're going to say, pardon me for cutting you off, Nachi. The pretty pictures are not just for the sake of having pretty pictures. The pretty pictures illustrate so that, the example that I gave, you see the God hugging a pharaoh and staring at him face to face, and then the gloss that I write at the bottom is, this helps us understand, what panim el panim is. So the pictures are really part of the Perush itself.
Correct. Now, before we get to the Perush, which I do want to talk about besides the pictures, and you already mentioned what the pictures are doing. They're on their pictures throughout. There are full-page pictures. There are little illustrations. There are part pictures. So it's throughout the entire Haggadah.
Oh, and I should just say, I'm again cutting you off. An early reviewer wrote to us to say he sat down to go through the Haggadah to write his review, and his daughter came up and she couldn't stop asking questions. In other words, this is a great trigger for kids to ask questions. I did refrain from putting in a pop-up pyramid, but that said, the pictures are very inviting.
That's interesting. I didn't think of the pop-up pyramid. Okay. So before, you do have, though, an introduction where you talk about a bunch of stuff that you just said there before on the podcast. And then you have two essays, two introductory essays, if you will. And their introductions, I think they're important for us to discuss them a little bit here. There's a reason why you put them in the beginning. One was the first essay that you put in is From Divine Kingship to Divine Citizenship, How the Torah Broke with Ancient Political Thought. And the second one is When Slaves Sang Pharaoh's Song, How the Torah Transformed Egyptian Propaganda. So those are essays. Perhaps you want to just mention a little bit in brief. I mean, obviously, listeners can check it out. And by the way, I will link in the show notes to Amazon's website. You can buy it from Koren, where anyone interested in them to be in Svarim stores, you can purchase the book. But if you want to just give a little bit of a synopsis.
Yeah, sure. So something that I've written on in full length form in a book is that the Torah is the first blueprint that we have for society anywhere in the ancient world, where there is an attempt to take power away from the powerful, such as kings, such as priests who were enormously powerful and had enormous resources in the ancient world, and to empower and ennoble the common people. The example that I gave before about panim el panim, being taken from the pharaohs and now is used in the Torah with regard to Am Yisrael. So this is a theme that comes up in a zillion different places in the Torah and also in many places in the Haggadah. Like I'll just give one example. Even if you haven't seen a picture of the Temple of Ramses at Abu Simbel in southern Egypt, if you did, you'd probably recognize it. But like many temples in ancient Egypt, there are enormous statues of the pharaoh that built the temple at its entrance. When I say enormous, I mean as high as 75 yards high. Okay, that's really, really big. And you would look at that and you might say, okay, why is there this statue here? And you might think, well, this is kind of like a founder's plaque, just like a donor today will get their name on the side of a building, maybe their bust at the entrance to the building. So the Egyptians really knew how to do it up, and so they made like these full size, these oversized statues of the donors, the pharaohs that built the temple. It ain't just that. Because when you go inside these temples and you look what's going on the walls, and they are richly decorated, it is unlike any. It's entirely unlike doing an archaeological tour anywhere in Eretz Yisrael. In Eretz Yisrael. I mean, I love Eretz Yisrael. Okay, I live here. Yes, but you go to Emek Ha'ila, where David slew Goliath, Goliath, and a tour guide can tell you, Goliath was standing here, David was standing there, and it takes a little bit of imagination because there's really nothing to see. All there is a valley. But in Egypt, it's all very, very vivid because the climate preserved everything. So when you go into these temples, what you see, wall after wall, picture after picture, is the connection between the god and the pharaoh. And that's really what it is, because the god isn't really interested in the people. And then you come to Chumash, and you see that kings don't play any role in the Mikdash. And the Torah describes the Beis HaMikdash in Sefer Devarim, Usmachtem lifnei Hashem Elokechem. This is a place to celebrate the relationship between the Ribbono Shel Olam and the people, Am Yisrael. So this theme comes up over and over again. So I have that introductory theme kind of giving the overview, and then that allows the reader to appreciate better many of these little points in the Haggadah itself. And then the second essay is about this. So in just the same way that I said that sometimes the Torah uses royal Egyptian propaganda like mighty hand and outstretched arm, and uses it now against the pharaohs to describe their defeat. So the place in which I think this happens in greatest dimension is in the story of the actual Yetziah itself, when Bnei Yisrael come out and when they cross Kriyas Yamsuf. So we're talking basically about Shmot, Perek Yudalid, Tedvav, and it turns out that there is an account by Ramses II, otherwise known as Ramses the Great, the greatest pharaoh of all time. Many would say, and I would agree, in my humble opinion, the Ramses who brought about the Shi'abud, right? There's two pharaohs, right? According to Chumash, there's the pharaoh of the Shi'abud, and then he dies, and then there's the pharaoh of the Makot. So, in my humble opinion, Ramses II is the pharaoh of Shi'abud Mitzrayim, and his greatest achievement, which was plastered all over the place in Egypt, and which slaves certainly knew about, is about a certain victory and battle that he has, and it's just remarkable how many phrases are taken that appear in Shmot, Yudalid, and Tedvav are parallels to phrases that you have in that composition. And it's almost like saying, here is like the greatest propaganda that any pharaoh ever had, what Ramses has to say about this particular battle that he had. And look, the Torah, and which probably Bnei Yisrael were familiar with, and now the Torah is using it in order to demonstrate the greatness of the Ribbono Shel Olam as he defeats the pharaoh himself.
Now I want to turn to the Haggadah itself and some passages from the Haggadah. And this is just what jumped out to me. I'm sure there are different things that maybe even to you and certainly to the listeners when they pick up the Haggadah and can look at it. So the first thing is Manishtana, right? Everyone's very familiar with Manishtana. Mm-hmm. And just to mention also, I'll put up the sampler on the WhatsApp chat. You can go to Koren's website. The sampler is there. You can click on the sample to see it. But on Manishtana, for example, so on this, you have a kind of a picture on the side tab almost for each part of the Seder. So this one is now, you have it, and it's like grayed out, except the color is by the one they're up to, so Magid. And Manishtana, you have the Hebrew text on top, English text on the bottom, on the right page, and the left, and, every one page is different, but here, that's how it is for Manishtana. On the left page, you have a picture depicting Pharaoh, the actual
I'll just say, Nachi, you were cut off there for a little bit, so I don't know if that was my internet or yours, but you might just want to say about, you start from the part about the tab.
So there's a tab on each page. There's a tab running through with each part of the Seder, and it's grayed out except the part that it's up to. So for here, for example, it's colored in for Magid. Then on this particular page, as Manishtana, the Hebrew is on top, the English is on the bottom, and on the left you have a picture, the color image on the top, and then you have the kind of gloss or commentary of yours on the bottom. And the picture is depicting the sun god Ra and on his nightly trip. So you want to talk a little about that because this is something that is interesting and important. We kind of alluded to this before, but Halayla Hazeh, Manishtana Halayla Hazeh. Why night? Why are we discussing night? Why did the Bnei Yisrael go out at night?
Okay, good. So let's talk about this. So it's something that we all know. The truth is, I had never thought about it before, but the major events of Yetzias Mitzrayim take place at night. Obviously, the Yetziah itself, right? Okay, the Machas Bechoros, etc. But also Kriyas Yamsuf is Bashmar Boker. It's in the middle of the night. Now, one could just say, look, that's just the way it happened. Okay, I guess that's possible. I guess so. Or maybe you could say the Ribbon Shalom is orchestrating things that they should happen dafka at night. Oh, and why dafka at night? Because in Egypt, the most significant god, Ra, is the sun god. And what you see in many depictions, including the one that Nachi is referring to here, you see a picture. It's of Ra getting into a boat to go to the underworld at night. In other words, the ancients believed that when the sun set, the sun kind of went under the world and came up on the other side. And when the sun sets, then the Egyptians thought that this was a dangerous time for their god, their sun god, Ra. And what you see in the picture is that he's on like this little skiff, this little boat on the Nile, and there are like these massive serpents attacking the boat. And Ra has his guards who are, thrusting spears at these serpents to chase them away. So along comes the Torah and says, well, our God actually does very well at night. In fact, all the big things he does are at night. It's like a shtuch.
So that's nice that you depict that. And that right there, that gives a flavor of the commentary of what you're in for when you're using this Haggadah. Then you turn to Avodah Me'inu.
So is this Chachma or is it Torah? I'll let you decide.
Exactly. And when you get to Avodah Me'inu, you have the, as you already mentioned, you have the outstretched hand, it's already to you, Chazaka, already to you. You have that, you have the image, you have the commentary that we already discussed here, so we don't have to talk about that one here. There's a number of other things. Mitzrayim, you talk about, and the Arabic word for Mitzrayim, why it's title called Mitzrayim, how it's still concentrated on the Nile.
That's just a Gavaldic.
Go ahead, talk about that.
This is such a Gavaldic word. I was shocked about this. When you go to Egypt, then you quickly see that Egyptians refer to their country in Arabic as al-Mitzer, which obviously, sounds a lot like Mitzrayim. So I thought in my simplicity, so how does it come to be that the Chumash calls Egypt Mitzrayim and modern Egyptians speaking Arabic call their country al-Mitzer? So I was certain it must be that in ancient Egyptian, the place was called something like that, Mitzr, Mitzrayim. And this is how it, it's often the Torah takes the lashon of a place, Damascus, Damasek, something like that. Okay, so it must be that ancient Egypt was called this, and that's how it winds up being this way, both in Chumash and for Arabs living in Egypt today. But no, it turns out that there's no such phrase, Mitzr, Mitzrayim, or anything like that in ancient Egyptian. They called the place Kahat or something like that. So how does it come to be that a modern-day Egyptian calls his country Mitzr? And the answer is because it says so in the Torah. And let me explain how that works. Maybe the earliest Christian community was what we call the Coptic Christian community. That means Egyptian Christians, right? Because Egypt is right next to the Holy Land, So the earliest Christians living in Egypt, they had this language, Coptic, and they translated the whole of the Tanakh into their language. And place names they didn't translate, they just transliterated. So they took Mitzrayim and they transliterated that into Coptic. I don't know exactly what it's like, but it's something like Mitzr, Mitzrayim. And then, because that became part of Egyptian culture, then when the Muslims came in whatever it was, the 7th century or something like that, or 8th century, and took over, by then already the place was already called Mitzr or something like that because of Mitzrayim. This is how it has survived to this very day. So that a modern day Egyptian calls his country Mitzr because it says so in the Torah. Da'aka. So then what is Mitzrayim? What does Mitzrayim mean? What does it mean? It turns out that the best explanation that I've heard is that it's not from the lashon of tsar, it's from the lashon of mitzra, of like a boundary in Aramaic, a boundary. What's the boundary? In the ancient world, the Nile was the outer boundary, the westernmost boundary of civilization. Because when you look at a map, kind of a topographical map, what you see is that west of the Nile is utter nothingness for thousands of miles, because all we have is the Sahara. And in ancient Egypt, you couldn't travel from the Nile more than 40 kilometers without dying. That is to say, you can't put enough water on the back of a donkey to take you more than 40 kilometers and hope to come home as well. And so it was truly like going to Mars. And so it really was the boundary of the civilized world.
So another thing that you have in here is also maps. And one in particular I want to discuss is Goshen. So in Vayar Sham, it says, "V'atav yeshnu avadecha be'eretz Goshen." And I don't know if I mentioned before, so when you try to show in Haggadah what you're talking about, you like put a color. So be'eretz, the text is in black, and the be'eretz Goshen is kind of color-coded, so you can tell that that is the part that you're, as you mentioned before, you're kind of glossing, you're commentating on. So talk about Goshen and the map here in Haggadah. You want to talk about Goshen?
Goshen, look, it's clearly in the Nile Delta. And the Nile. Let's just explain what I mean by that. So, Egypt is in a phenomenally vast desert. Total nothing, not a drop, nothing, nowhere, desert, except for obviously along the Nile. A few kilometers in each direction, and then roughly around Cairo, north of that, there's like a big kind of V-shaped area called the Nile Delta, because the Nile there at that point, I don't remember exactly how much it is, 80, 100 kilometers, something like that. It splits into tributaries, and therefore there's tremendous irrigation in that area. And when you look at, kind of a satellite image of Egypt, so the whole area is totally lush green. That is where Goshen is, and it fits, of course, with what the brothers say, to Paro. We have mir'eh, we have sheep, and they need grazing land, and so therefore we want it to be in Eretz Goshen. This is kind of like the eastern part of the Delta. We don't know exactly where it is, but it's the eastern part of the Delta. The more important thing is that there's a whole bunch of other names that we see in later on in Sefer Shmot, Migdol and Sukkot and Ramses, and these we know exactly where they are, and we can find them today as well.
You mentioned Ramses. That's a good thing that we should jump to, because Vayanunu, and it says that they built Ori Miskenes Leparoi as Pisoim v'es Ramses. Yeah. So you have a picture and a discussion on this, and we could talk about the pyramids. You mentioned no Papa Pyramid. We could talk about the pyramid and the
I know that we're supposed to avoid Kfira, but our Avotenu didn't build the pyramids. I hope we can continue the interview, but it's just true. Josephus, I think, is the one that's responsible for this. He says that Bnei Yisrael built the pyramids, but first of all, nothing in Chumash says that we built pyramids. We built Arei Miskenot, and also the pyramids. They stopped building them long before the Avos got there. The reason they stopped building pyramids is because they were phenomenally counterproductive. Their purpose was to hide treasures, but when you build a massive monument that says "Come and rob me," then it kind of doesn't work. And that's why they went from there to like mamish, the total opposite. And that's what we have in the Valley of the Kings, where they dug deep into the ground to create like burial caves that would be hard to find to begin with and would be covered over anyway.
So Pisim and Ramses are Miskenes. What does that mean?
Yeah, it means storage cities. What is that? What's a storage city? Like, do we have those today, or where do we see those in Chumash? Right, we don't see these in Chumash. Look, when you're on the ground in Egypt, and I have pictures of this in the Haggadah, we have to understand. Let me put it this way. Let's say that you're living in ancient times, and you decide, what, Nachi, you're an attorney? Is that what you told me? Okay,
correct.
Let's say that instead of being an attorney, you decided you wanted to be a priest somewhere. I don't mean a galach, I mean someone who does temple work, And you said, well, where am I going to get the best deal? Let me look around in Egypt and in Bavel and in Ashur and in the land of the Hittites. Let me see where I can get the best deal. You know where you get the worst deal? In Chumash, okay? Because in Chumash, Sefer Vayikra tells us exactly what korbanos we have to bring, and not one sheep more. Okay, but elsewhere, oh my gosh, the staggering proportions. I mean, you can see this. There's a temple that we visited on our trips. It's one of many, but this one you can really see it. There are about literally. There's a temple, a big temple, like maybe 3 or 4 times the size of the Beis HaMikdash, surrounded by, this is literal, 15 football fields of Arei Miskenot, of storage cities. This just means like silos or ancient silos. And this is where they kept all of the produce that was going to be used in that temple. So every temple had just enormous silos or remi skenot all around them, and these were made out of mud brick with straw, which you can see there. Today you can walk right up to, in many places, straw mud bricks made out of straw from the period of the Shiabud. In fact, I was on one trip and a guy, he showed me at the airport. He says, here, he had a little baggie. Here's a little bit of my authentic straw mud from the mud brick. I was like, no, you're not supposed to take that. Okay, so friends, if we ever go back to Egypt, don't take the mud bricks. Okay, let's leave some for the fish. Okay, for the rest of us. Yeah.
So I guess someone's taking it and showing it by their seder. So
yes,
Makis. We get to the Makis. The first thing to discuss, and there's a couple things that you discuss here we can talk about, but let's start with Makis in sets of 3. Right.
Yeah. This is the coolest thing. Look. Okay. So we obviously, from the lens of Chazal, they're Eser Makos, right? And Datzah Chadash Be'achav 10. Okay. But it's pretty clear when you're reading Chumash carefully that what we have are 3 sets of 3, followed by Makat B'chorot. What do I mean 3 sets of 3? All right, you can see this just from a literary perspective, that in like the first Makkah, Dam and Sfardeya each have Moshe Rabbeinu coming to Paro, and then a discussion with Paro, and then the Makkah. And Kinim is much shorter. It just says that Hashem said to Moshe to harem et matcha, and along will come Kinim. There's none of the interchange with Paro. And so it is with the next set of 3, and then the following set of 3. The first 2, that is 1 and 2 are long, 3 is short. 4 and 5 are long, 6 is short. 7 and 8 are long, 9 is short. So there's 3 sets of 3, and there's many terms that kind of appear over and over. And then, like Makat B'chorot is really different. The lead up to it is different. So what we really have is 3 sets of 3 plus 1. It just turns out 3. So why 3 sets of 3? So this is really cool, just about how Egyptians thought about numbers. The number for a lot, really a lot, is 9. And you'd say, 9? Why not 10? Here's why 9 is a lot. Because 1 is company. No, excuse me. One is alone. 2 is company. 3 is a crowd, as we say, right? 3. So if 3 is a lot, then 3 threes is really a lot. Okay. So that's how they thought of it. 3 threes is a lot. And there's some artwork where their own enemy, they referred to their enemies as the 9 bows, like bow and arrow, the 9 bows. But it's not like they can name them. It's just a way of saying a lot of enemies. 3 times 3. So I think that's kind of cool also.
And you have a picture next to it showing one of the pharaohs stepping on 9. You have 3, 3,
right.
3.
That's
so you
right.
Kind of show it.
Yeah, this is the cool thing. So many of the statues of the pharaohs have the pharaohs, if you're looking like totally from above, like, just a picture down onto the statue, then you see the pharaoh's sandals or feet treading on these nine bows. And in their literature, what it says everywhere, kibush is referred to, conquest is referred to as where your foot treads. Where your foot treads, that means conquest. This is exactly the lashon that we have in Chumash and in Sefer Yehoshua. Kol makom asher tidroch kaf raglecha lecha yeh. Wherever your foot treads, it will be yours. And you only find this really in Sefer Devarim and Sefer Yehoshua, i.e. Sefer Devarim, people that had been in Mitzrayim, and Sefer Yehoshua, a generation later. In the rest of Tanakh, you don't find this idiom because they had lost it over time.
I think it should be clear that's what the Haggadah is doing, is that the Haggadah is showing, you're making these kind of parallels or making things clear what was going on back there, and then you're showing
when
the
you say the
pictures.
Haggadah, you mean this Haggadah. I don't know if...
This Haggadah, the Echoes of Egypt Haggadah, the one that we're discussing.
I didn't mean that as a sales point. I just wanted to, so that the listeners would be clear now what you were talking about.
Absolutely. Now, we continue on. Another thing in the Makkas, v'oisais ze'amata, right? The Makkas says, oisais, the Makkas were brought about with the staff. And now you have a picture depicting a pharaoh holding the, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, the heka, the shepherd's staff. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so this is Egypt. Cool, right. Okay, so, so there's Moshe Rabbeinu with the snap. And the Rebbeinu Shalom says to him, Maze biyadecha. What kind of question? Maze biyadecha? Mateh. Yeah, that's a mateh. I mean, I don't know. What was the purpose of that discussion? I'm not really sure. But it becomes clear when you understand the symbolism, the iconography of Egyptian culture. Egyptian pharaohs are often depicted two hands, and there's something they're holding in each hand, kind of crossed over one another. One of them looks like an enormous candy cane or question mark. And what that really is a shepherd's crook. Because in Egypt, the shepherd's crook was the symbol of governance. Just like a shepherd kind of herds the flock into line, so too the pharaoh would kind of keep order through his proverbial shepherd's crook, and so that was the sign of his authority and his rule. And so when HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe, "Ma'azeh biyadecha," and then he gives Moshe Rabbeinu 3 or 4 otot and says to him, okay, now you're going to take this mateh, this shepherd's crook, and you're going to go cast it before Paro and demonstrate who's really in charge here, then we might say that Moshe Rabbeinu went up against Paro face to face. And I would say he went up to him mateh against mateh to mateh, crook to crook.
Now, you have a bunch of comments on some of the makas, but I want to talk about one. You have an interesting vart over here, which is you talk about when it comes to kinim, and it says etzba lekimi, it's the finger of God, rather than the hand, as over time it says in the Torah. Yeah, talk about it.
This is Gaval. This is not my chiddush, but yeah. Okay, so look, the Chartumim there, they say about kinim etzba elokim hi. Okay. And we never find anything in Tanakh referred to as the Etzba Elokim. As I said earlier, oftentimes you'll have Yad Hashem. And the truth is that makes sense, right? Because it's an idiom, just like people do things with a hand, they pick things up, they strike, they wave. So that's an idiom that's used also with regard to the Ribono Shel Olam. So what is this Etzba Elokim? What can you do with a finger? What of power or of might can you do with just a finger? It's a strange phrase, Etzba Elokim hi. Okay, so what you see, and this is in a lot of places, and this is a great picture of this in the Haggadah. Picture of a couple of guys. They're on a little skiff. That means like a little, I don't know, kind of like something even smaller than a canoe, somewhere between a canoe and a kayak, something like that, something really small, on the Nile. Now here's the thing. The Nile is an incredibly dangerous place because it's infested with crocodiles. I mean, these crocodiles we have today. I forgot to bring something in the Haggadah. I had to bring picture. I should have brought pictures of the massive mummies of crocodiles, like 19 feet long. Okay, now that's not an exaggeration. And a mummy, you understand, is shriveled, right? That means, in real life it was even bigger. These are massive, massive crocodiles in the Nile. That meant that anybody who went for a little sail in the Nile, he had to say Birkas HaGomel in Egyptian, okay? It's just, forget about airplanes. Just to cross the Nile was mamish sakanas nefashos, and they knew this. So you have a lot of pictures, guys getting into a boat, knowing this might be the end. All it takes is one whack of a crocodile tail and your lunch. So they get in, and what you can see is that they're taking their index finger and they point to the water, but the illustrations are beautiful. They show what's above the water, the little boat, and they show what's beneath the water, some fish, some crocodiles. But when they're pointing down, they're not pointing to anything in particular, because as we all know, if you're in a canoe, you can't really see into the water. There's the reflection off the water. Maybe sometimes, I think maybe you can't really see anything into the water. So they're just pointing down into the water broadly. And what you see then is kind of like the captions, kind of like in a comic, they say the spell, say the spell. And what they're referring to is, instead of saying Tfilas Haderech, they would make a spell, like mamash like Harry Potter. They would try to cast a spell on the water or on the crocodiles that they shouldn't be lunch. And so they felt that the way in which you cast a spell is not with a wand, but by using your index finger. And so they point to the water. And so the index finger really was a source of power. It was a source of sorcery, of magic power. And so when it's not, no member of Am Yisrael ever says in the Tanakh that something happened, that was Etzba Elokim. No, but the Chartumim who are Egyptian, who are thinking in Egyptian terms, think, wow, there's like this pella going on here with the kinim. This power must be the etzba Elokim. The deity of Am Yisrael must have done something with his etzba to bring around this makkah.
The Haggadah is not only Egyptology in the sense of you have some things a little later. So like the elephantine papyri, when it comes to when you're discussing chametz and matzah, that's a little later. So why did you decide to include that?
Right. Okay. So right. So in Achinami, right. What are called the. Let me just. I'm not sure that everybody is familiar with this term that you used there, Nachi. There's something called the elephantine papyri. Let me explain what that is. So most remarkable find. From around the time of the early period of Shivat Zion, I don't know, maybe the time of Nehemiah, maybe even a drop later, we have found in Egypt papyri that describe in vivid detail a colony of Jews at the southern tip of Mitzrayim in Aswan, which is, by the way, mentioned in Sefer Yirmiyahu. In an island stuck right in the middle of the Nile called Elephantine, and their mode of religiosity is very complex. They're clearly they do Shabbos, they do Pesach, they do Avodah Zarah, they do a lot of things. So yeah, and what we have there is like a command from a general to the island, basically saying, "Okay, folks." Pesach is coming up. It's going to be between the 14th and the 21st, and you got to get rid of all your chametz, and it's mamish like Pesach cleaning. That's what he's talking about. It's the earliest record that we have of the observance of Pesach outside of the Tanakh. So this doesn't have anything to do with Yetziat Mitzrayim per se, but look. The truth is, Nachi, you spoke about the proliferation of Haggadahs, right? So there's really two types of Haggadahs, to be honest, okay? There are Haggadahs that mamish explain the text, and diukim in the text of the Haggadah. And then there are Haggadahs that are kind of thematic Haggadahs. There can be an ecological Haggadah, and a feminist Haggadah, and an Eretz Yisrael Haggadah, and an October 7th Haggadah. There really is such a thing. There is now, yes, unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever it is, that's depending on both maybe. So this is an Egypt Haggadah. That means that, everything that has to do with ancient Egypt, and this has to do with Pesach, so no, it gets thrown into.
Yeah, it makes sense. I wasn't criticizing. I was more like pointing out that there's other things. You mentioned Haggadah. Haggadah is the place where, I think it's unfortunate in the sense of, things get, dumped on the Haggadah. Every concept, every thought someone had ever, I have this Haggadah, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
I'll give you another example where I did that in the Haggadah. So, when we think of connections between the Egyptian culture and ours, so obviously we think of, Chumash, Shibud Mitzrayim, like that. But the truth is, Chazal were also very familiar with a lot of this stuff. Because in the time of the Tanaim, there's already a lot of Jews who are living in Alexandria. And at that time, there's still a lot of hieroglyphs and a lot of deities. And malasot, this stuff, it crosses over and they're aware of it. And by understanding Egyptian culture, we can even understand a Tosefta that says that if you find, it discusses there when you find a coin that has images of Avodah Zarah on it, that you're supposed to the Lashon is to throw it into Yam HaMelach, to basically get rid of it. And, so, and it says, so what sort of images are we supposed to look out for? Okay, so I think it says there, Shemesh and Yereach in one form or another. And then it says if it has, there's a Tosefta that says if it has on it this is the Lashon, a menikan. That means a nurser or a nursing mother. What's the matter with nursing mothers? Oh, until you go to Egypt and you see what I have on whatever page that is there, and you see that you have Isis, or I forget which, Osiris, I forget which one it is. Basically, there's one of the goddesses nursing one of the gods, and she's always in that position, holding the baby and nursing him. So that's like an image of Avodah Zarah that Chazal were familiar with. It's totally Egyptian. So you wouldn't know what a menikan is unless you know this stuff.
Korban Pesach. This is something that you discussed. Kind of the Rambam, Moreh Nevuchim. You already mentioned the Moreh Nevuchim before, which is the, let me see your term, how you put it, sacrificial worship as a rejection of Egyptian thought, which is kind of like the Shittas Rambam and Moreh Nevuchim in general when he talks about Korbanos, right, to some degree.
Right. So you're talking about what I mentioned from the end of Parshas Yisro, maybe, I think. Oh yeah. Oh, this is Gavaldic, if I may say so myself. This is actually my own insight, and nobody should publish this. I haven't published this yet. Okay, so everyone here is on Scout's honor. Okay, you'll share this at the Seder table, but you're not going to publish it. Okay, here we go. So right after the Aseret Dibros, pardon me, I'm opening my Chumash. So Hashem says, "Atem reitem ki min hashamayim dibarti imachem." So you guys have seen that I spoke to you from Shamayim. Lo tasuniti Elohei chesef ve'Elohei zahav lo tasu lachem. This is not talking about avodah zarah. This is talking about you can't make representations of me to serve me because I'm up in Shamayim. That is to say, I don't have a guf and I am not visible. So you can't make representations of me. Instead, it says mizbach adama ta'aseli. You should make for me, right? The mizbeach adama. And you should bring to it its korbanot. Now, what is the connection here between lo tasuniti eloke kesef eloke zahav lo tasu lachem? You shouldn't make a representation, a statue, if you will, of me. Rather, as opposed to lo tasuniti eloke kesef, mizbach adama ta'aseli. There's clearly some, you can tell from the diction, there's some type of opposition. Don't make for me a statue, make for me a mizbeach. But what exactly? Well, how is one the opposite of the other? How does it counter? So in Egypt, what you see, this is an amazing thing. In Egypt, they bring lots of what I would call offerings, never korbanot, meaning in ancient Egypt, at least in the time that Bnei Yisrael were there, there's no concept of a mizbeach. There's no altar. There's no, putting a piece of meat up on the stones, lighting a fire, and watching the smoke go up. The Egyptians don't do that. All of their offerings are platters that are placed in front of the pesel of avodah zarah, and everything is raw. All the meat is raw. Okay, so what the Torah is doing here is teaching Am Yisrael how to move away from the way in which the Egyptians served their God to how Am Yisrael is expected to serve a Kadosh Baruch Hu. What it's saying here is, Lo tasuni ti eloke kesef eloke zahav. Don't think you can make for me a representation, a statue, and then bring it platters of food, because mina shamayim dibarti imachem. I'm up in Shamayim, and therefore to serve me, mizbach adama ta'aseli. You have to make a mizbeach because I'm up kivyachol. I'm up in Shamayim, and therefore it says v'zavach alavet olotecha v'shalamecha. Right? Ola, it all goes up. So it's saying that we're going to have a new type of avoda here. So that's, I think, a nice shot in those psukim, how the two psukim go together.
Very nice.
Mm-hmm.
So, by the way, I mean, that should be clear. We're just pulling out different examples, different things from the Haggadah. There's obviously more here that we aren't discussing.
Yeah, let me also say one of the challenges in writing a Haggadah, because I'm sure there are people out there who are going to write their own Haggadahs, because we have to have new Haggadahs every year. If you want a Haggadah that's going to be practical, okay, for using at the Seder, you can't write, a long treatise on something. You have this amazing Mahalach. There's no room for an amazing Mahalach in a Haggadah.
And I think that's something you did very nice. All of these pieces are small. They're very digestible. Right. You can read it at the Seder and then say it at the Seder. So many Haggadahs, like you're saying, very interesting.
180 words. 180 words. That each one. Yeah.
Yeah, you've written a couple of big books. You know what big books are. This is not a big book in that sense.
I can be long-winded, but you can't do that at a Seder. Not if you want people to read it in real time, and certainly not to share it. So, yeah. Vortlach.
Exactly. That's basically what this is. So, Shvei Chamascha, you talk about Shvei Chamascha, that was added after the Crusades. And then there's actually a very interesting one about when Hallel, Atzbeim Kesef Izav, and you mentioned the Karnak Kashet, which I was not familiar with. So, you want to talk about this, and you have a picture of it as well. You can see the historical image. So tell the listeners about that. I didn't know anything about this.
Yeah, this is just unbelievable. Okay, so I mean, I'm sure all of you out there have noticed there's really a lot of statues. Like every museum seems to have many statues from Egypt. So yes, they made lots of statues, but there were a lot of them were preserved. This is what would happen. So Nebuch, the pharaohs had a problem. There's like this main temple complex. The main temple complex in ancient Egypt was in a place called Luxor, otherwise known as Thebes. And there's this massive, it's the largest temple complex in the world, called the Karnak Temple. And every just like when U.S. presidents move into the White House, you got to rip out all the bedding and all the curtains and put in your own bedding and your own curtains. So every pharaoh would want to have his own statues in the Karnak Temple, statues of himself, statues of his favorite gods, and they had many of them. But the problem is, and then the next pharaoh comes and he's got a whole bunch of statues too. There's not room for all these statues. There's only limited room in the temple and people have to come and do stuff in there. So what do you do with a statue when you're no longer using it? You bury it in a statue geniza. And that's what they did. I mean, that's my lashon of geniza, but that is mamish what they did. There's this one area of this temple, they started to dig and they found statues and they kept digging and digging and more statues and more statues and more statues. Over the space of 6 years, from like 1903 to 1909, they discovered in this one pit 900 stone statues and 17,000 bronze statues. That's a geniza, a statue geniza.
It's amazing. And then
the picture in the Haggadah of like this French archaeologist in this bright white suit standing over mamish avadim, modern Egyptians or 1900 Egyptians in mud, because this whole thing was mud, because this temple is right on the banks of the Nile and the water table under the ground, would fill up daily. So they're mamish swimming in mud, pulling out these statues from the statue geniza called the Karnak Cachet or Cachette, something like that. Yeah.
It is not the dead who praise the Lord, nor those who go down to the silent grave. And then you have a picture of King Tut's tomb and all the stuff that he thought, quote unquote, he was taking with him to the afterlife.
Oh my goodness. King Tut's tomb they found in it, the famous thing, right? It was discovered in 1922. It was the only untouched tomb found by Howard Carter and mamash untouched. They found inside that tomb the number of things that Tut took with him, Kivyachol, 5,800 artifacts. And there's a picture of like exactly how they found it. Yeah, it's just unbelievable. It's unbelievable. They believed in the afterlife the way you and I believe in tomorrow. It was like that concrete and palpable. We also believe in Olam Haba. I'm not saying we don't, but for them, like you mamish had to plan. It's concrete. I'm telling you, like the way we think about tomorrow.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. You see it, and here you can see it in person. In the sense of like the imagery. You have these ancient images. You have then updated, new colorized kind of illustrations, Egyptian styled illustrations, as well as you have those pictures like we were just talking about Karnak and King Tut, where you have the kind of from 100 years ago, 150 years ago, whatever it is, when they were excavating it.
Right.
And you have just these, also you have interesting little factoids like Kerach, the bald would-be priest, and you talk about why Kerach means bald and why Kerach was, basically the Egyptian priests were bald.
Okay, so we can talk about that. Yeah, right. So this is an example of something it's not in the Haggadah, but you take all your vortlach about Egypt and the Torah and you throw them all in. Okay, so it also helps. It helps in the design. It's a challenge. Look, let me say something from a backstory. Okay, so when you have a visual Haggadah, as this is, then you have a challenge because you have your visual image and you have the text of the Haggadah in 2 languages, and you have your own little peirush, and you want to get it all on 1 2-page spread. It's not so simple to space things out that way. So sometimes having like filler material. Okay, we're not going to do any Haggadah on this page. We're going to do some vort about ancient Egypt and the Torah. Okay, and no one's going to notice it until Nachi does. Okay, but that's fine. Okay, so one of the pages like this. So think about Korach. Okay, Korach. So Korach, that lashon Korach, it comes from bald, right? Bald. So who names their kid bald? So what turns out is that Korach or ancient Egyptian priests were bald. It means that they shaved. They shaved all their hair. They shaved all their bodily hair, just like Aaron a Cohen at his consecration. all bodily hair. Hamevin Yavin. So these guys are bald. And the thing is that to be that level of priest in ancient Egypt, anybody could do it. Like, you didn't have to have a lineage. Anybody could sign up to be a priest. Now, this fits perfectly. Along comes Korach, and he says to Moshe Rabbeinu, Kol ha'ida kulam kedoshim. What is this business that you're the only, that Aaron is the only one who's a Kohen, a priest? We can all be priests. In other words, what Korach was doing was he was coming with an Egyptian mindset. Everybody should be a priest. That's what we know. And so they call him Korach because he wanted to be like an Egyptian priest, bald. He wanted to be, totally like an Egyptian priest. Maybe that's why he's called Korach. It's interesting that the Korach, we actually know Korach from one place before Parshas Korach. And that's in Shmot Perek Vav, if you recall. It gives there's a little bit of a genealogy there. The first, there's Shevet Reuven and Shevet Shimon, and then Shevet Levi. And Korach is mentioned there, and it says that Korach's eldest son was called Asir. Asir. What does it mean? He was a prisoner? What's Asir? So Asir, friends, is Osiris, meaning he named his Bechor after an Egyptian god. Okay, so you can see where Korach was holding.
It's, as you said, even though it's just this vart that has nothing to do with that God necessarily, it has to do with the time, and you're bringing that whole tkufa to life.
All the points connect together. That's right. The whole is greater than than the sum of its parts. Yeah.
And as you're saying, besides the commentary, it's really the images and the imagery and the pictures and everything here in the Haggadah that really brings it to life for the Seder. Mm-hmm. So you get to V'nir Pari v'cheloi v'yamsuf. You're giving thanks to Hashem. We say that he cast Pharaoh and his army into the Yamsuf, mm-hmm. and you have an image of them on the chariot. And he talked about Pharaoh's armies. What were the Egyptian armies like? We think about it. We kind of have, as the kids, we always thought, the chariots are running, chasing after them, but kind of have the actual image and talk about it. You talk about it in that God a little bit, just kind of, so you can kind of really see what that was and imagine what was happening.
Well, what's significant here is that, we read the story of Kriyas Yamsuf, there's chariots, right? The Egyptians had chariots. Yeah, but the Egyptians only had chariots till about the year 1000. Let's say sometime in the time of the Shoftim, okay? After that, they gave up on chariots because if you think your automobile costs a lot and you're taking it to the shop all the time, chariots were worse. Chariots break down all the time. They eventually domesticated the horse and began to ride horseback. And this is important because there's a certain type of kfir out there. So many parts of the Torah, they're written many hundreds of years later. Would people have known hundreds of years later that during the period that the Torah is describing, as Yetzias Mitzrayim, that in fact they were not riding on horseback, that they were riding on chariots? There's no there's no history books to look up, and there's no internet sites to go look at to see what things were like. So it's period perfect. Okay, the fact that there's a description here of the chariots. So
the imagery in the Haggadah, where's it all from? Is it all for the images that you?
Wow, that's a really good question, and it's the bracha of our times, Nachi, I would say. In other words, a lot of the scholarship that's there is from maybe the last 20 or 30 years. Some of it's mine, most of it isn't. I gathered what's out there, but then you want to make it concrete, you want to make it visual. There's now all of these image banks, Shutterstock and Getty Images, and there's at least a dozen of them, and you can get a picture of almost anything. In other words, if you read an article that speaks about something, you look it up in Google Images, and you get all these versions, and then you find the ones that are high resolution. But it's all of this is the last 20 years that all this is now available. Otherwise, for me I wouldn't be able to run around from one museum to the next and looking and taking my own pictures. No, there's all this these image banks makes it all possible.
The font in Haggadah is the classic Koren font, and the translation was a previous translation that Koren had already for the Haggadah.
Yes, it was. Yeah, this was the translation executed by a woman named Jessica Sachs for the Rabbi Sachs Zecher Tzaddik Livracha Haggadah. And I didn't. This is what Koren was using. The truth is, I didn't see any reason to tamper with it, play with it. So that's what it is. Yeah.
Who's this Haggadah for?
Wow. I thought honestly. Nachi, I thought it would be for nerds. That is, what do I mean by that? I mean by, yeah. So you mentioned I wrote this book, Ani Mamin, Biblical Criticism, Historical Accuracy, and the 13 Principles of Faith. Because, people have questions about, they come across claims or of biblical criticism, and what do you do with that? You just just dismiss them, or maybe there's more Deos in our Masorah than we knew about. Okay, but that certain people think about that. Not so many people think about that. Yeah, maybe worldwide, a nice number of people, but it's a small percentage, let's face it. And it's not just a small percentage in Lakewood, it's a small percentage even in Riverdale and in Beit Shemesh and places like that. So I just figured, whoever might have been interested in that sort of stuff. So this is an extension of it to some degree. But it turns out that I think, I don't know, there's something, it has a wider reach. So, and as I say, one of our early reviews, I don't know when you're airing this. We are taping this now. It is just now after Rosh Chodesh Adar. Okay, so we're not even after Purim yet. And one of the early reviewers, someone who's preparing a review of the Haggadah, as I mentioned earlier, he said, I started to open it up, and my daughter came over right away and started asking me all these questions. So, I think once something is visual, it really it communicates in a different way. I think that look, for all of us who learned in yeshiva, we're very textually oriented, but we all know plenty of people who are not textually oriented, or maybe our wives or sisters, or mothers, we're not necessarily always textually oriented the way that we are, those of us that learned in yeshiva. And suddenly, when you have a picture, it's a different type of learning, So I don't know. We'll see who it's for. I think the answer is open. And I also figured, it's not for me to say this, but this is what I've been told. I figured, okay, there'll be one nerd at each Seder table who will be into this. And as you noted, we made it big. It's the proportions of the book as a book are on the larger side, because I want people to hold up the pictures and say, look at this picture and let me show you what's going on. And I don't know, people tell me, I'm going to get 3 or 4. So, I don't know, I'm not opposed, but so I don't know really who the answer. I told you who I had in mind initially. I tried to write it in a way that's engaging. So we'll see. I don't know.
I think visual learning is good for everyone, especially when it comes to Pesach and Haggadah and
Sure.
the Mitzrayim, right? Everyone's supposed to see themselves as if they went out from Mitzrayim. So you can actually see and visualize what he actually did Mitzrayim and the Egyptians, when otherwise it's sometimes hard to, even though we have all the different Torah, sometimes it's hard to actually see like what actually was culture and life like in Mitzrayim. So I will link in the show notes for those interested in purchase the Haggadah. As I said, it's a little bit taller. It's full color, glossy pages. It's $29.95. I will link in the show notes to Amazon, to Koren, your local farm store. And thank you, Rabbi Dr. Berman, for joining me.
Okay, just let me just say, and then you'll do the thank you over again. Yeah. So, friends, if this sort of Torah, if you will, I think it's Torah. If these types of insights and ways of thinking about things are appealing to you, I invite you to tune into my newly launched podcast. I have a podcast called The Bible Bar. It's the podcast of the Bible department at Bar-Ilan University, where I teach. And the format of the podcast is that we start from the beginning, from Breshit Perek Aleph, and each week we're moving to another Perek sequentially, Perek Bet, Perek Gimel, all the way through. And each week I have on another scholar. Some of them are colleagues of mine from Bar-Ilan. Some of them are Jewish. Some of them are not Jewish, from all around the world. All of them, I am kind of curating it so that they have something interesting and meaningful to say. So if this type of vein of what Nachi and I have been doing here is appealing to you, you are invited to give us a try, the Bible Bar.
Okay, well, thank you, Rabbi Dr. Berman, for joining me on the podcast. And as I said, I'll link in the show notes to the Haggadah, which you can purchase from Amazon, from Koren, from your local farm store, and hopefully it'll help provide you with a more meaningful Seder.
Okay, and Pesach Kasher v'Sameach to one and all.